Join me in welcoming Greg Lukianoff, Randy Kennedy, and Nadine Strawson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Greg, I'm going to jump in by starting with you. So just this morning, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic saying Elon Musk is right about the First Amendment and Twitter. And it argued that all four of the reasons the Supreme Court has given for protecting free speech apply online as well as in the public square. And even though Twitter isn't required to respect the First Amendment, because those words say Congress shall make no law, they don't say Elon Musk shall make no law, I said he was correct to say that Twitter should essentially follow First Amendment standards. You've argued something similar in an open letter to Elon Musk. Tell our friends why you agree that Elon Musk should essentially follow the First Amendment.
Thank you, Jeffrey. This is wonderful. There's no person and no institution that I can imagine that deserves this more. This is the old museum used to be right by my house, and I'm so glad that this is being used properly and will continue to exist. So congratulations. I am the rude American who shows up in other countries and doesn't do the whole, well, you know, European system has its thing about freedom of speech and we have our weird little thing and of course you guys are better. I actually show up and very rudely explain that the American First Amendment is the longest, cleverest meditation on how you have freedom of speech in the real world. The jurisprudence includes truly some of the brightest people in American history, if I could be so bold, thinking about how you actually do it. So when people are trying to figure out how to regulate it, it's not that Elon Musk must abide by the First Amendment, but if you want to actually see how you maximize freedom of opinion while actually taking care of things like incitement and harassment, etc., that's where you should look, because it is a font of wisdom of how you actually make sure that opinion can be maximized while not falling into the trap of viewpoint discrimination. And I actually took it one level farther. My co-author Jonathan Haidt and I both believe that social media is this major disruptive force. Like, we were underestimating how big of a force it is, and is affecting every facet of our lives globally. But so was the printing press. And we're dealing with something where that brought millions of people talking to each other. We now have added billions of people talking directly to each other. It's going to be disruptive. But I don't think we should give up on the idea that social media, when you have billions of people talking to each other, that it could be much more productive to furthering human knowledge, potentially. So I think we've become too modest in our hopes for what social media could be. We're too focused on the negative side, and I would like to see, Musk draw from the wisdom of the First Amendment, but also think about a way that it could be a force for good.
Wonderful, thanks so much for that. Nadine, I haven't asked you whether or not you agree, and it's time to acknowledge this is, you could even call it a radical position. I wouldn't say that it's shared by, I wouldn't assume it's shared by most of our audience or by most Americans. Do you agree with it or not?
I absolutely agree with the position, and let me say that I support not the First Amendment, because the First Amendment coexisted with massive censorship for the vast majority of its history. I support the Supreme Court's modern interpretation of the First Amendment, not because it came from the Supreme Court, but because it accords with fundamental principles that maximize not only individual liberty and truth-seeking, as Greg was elucidating, but is absolutely essential for promoting equality and human rights, especially for those who have traditionally been oppressed and marginalized, and Randy has written beautifully about this. None of our movements for equal rights could have gotten off the ground without a robust interpretation of the First Amendment. And going to the connection that Jeff kept signaling between we, the people, and the First Amendment, as the Supreme Court has said, speech about public affairs, public issues, is more than a matter of individual self-expression, important as that is. It is the essence of self-government. And as the Supreme Court itself recognized, the most important platform now, as a practical matter, not only for individual self-expression, but also for self-government, is online, social media in particular. And so I would defend Musk's right to go a different direction. That is his First Amendment right, but I join Greg's really powerful letter in urging him, for the sake of liberty, equality, human rights, and democracy, please adhere to these now time-tested standards that the Supreme Court has worked out since the mid-20th century.
Thank you very much for that. All right, Randy, in the interest of viewpoint diversity, I'm just going to ask you to put on the table the argument on the other side, which of course begins with the claim that far from being a vehicle for political expression and thoughtful deliberation, the net can be a font of misinformation, of doxing, and of harassment, and that values like equality and dignity are important online and should be respected. Say more about the argument on the other side, and then tell us what you think.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here with colleagues and friends. And I'm going to answer the question, but before I do want to have a salutation. You mentioned that I clerked for Justice Marshall. When I clerked for Justice Marshall, Judge Luttig clerked for Chief Justice Berger. And back in those days, and now we're going back several decades, I recall meeting a very gracious young attorney, and it's wonderful to, over time, see a gracious young attorney hang on to that virtue and become a more mature, but still very gracious, mature jurist. And so it's really wonderful to see Judge Luttig here with us. Now, on this question about Twitter, I'm going to say two things. And I think there may be something of a difference between my colleagues up here and me, and not a feigned difference, but a real difference. I would really underline what Nadine just said, but take it a step further, because there are some people who, in order to protect freedom of expression, want to actually impose obligations upon private institutions. So, for instance, there are various states that have passed laws requiring private colleges and universities to adhere by First Amendment precepts. There are some people that want to do the same thing with institutions like Twitter. I'm against that. It seems to me that in order to protect pluralism, we ought to respect private institutions as opposed to public institutions. It's a good thing to have a public sector governed by the First Amendment and a private sector. And the private sector can go, one of two ways. Private institutions could decide that they want to be more open than the First Amendment would require. Fine. On the other hand, it may be that a private institution wants to be more restrictive. In my view, fine. Again, for purposes of pluralism. Now, your second question had to do with, what about the people who are saying, there's disinformation? What about the horrible so-called hate speech? My view, and by the way, and that's real. That has costs. No question but that has costs. I think, however, that on this one, I guess I would link up with my colleagues here and say, of course there's costs. all good things in life cost something. But the protection of liberty, the protection of freedom is worth the cost of, and then, worth the cost of hurt feelings, worth the cost of people having to dig a little bit deeper to come up with the truthful information as opposed to disinformation. There are real costs, but those costs are costs worth paying for liberty, for the freedom that we have become used to because of the past 75 years of the opening up of the American constitutional mind.